Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Today, I am joined by Jacob Huebert, the president of the Liberty Justice Center. Mr. Huebert, where is the best place for people to find the work you do at the Liberty Justice Center?
You can read all about our work at libertyjusticecenter.org.
What was the Foreign Advisory Controlled Applications Act of April 2024?
Well, this is a law that Congress passed and President Biden signed in April that effectively bans TikTok as of January 19th, 2025. The law technically doesn't ban it. It says that TikTok has to be divested in such a way that it no longer has any connection to any company based in or formed in China, because China is a foreign adversary. And as a practical matter, that means it's a ban because TikTok cannot be separated from its parent company. Its unique content recommendation engine that connects people to content they might be interested in was developed in and is maintained in China, so that if you severed US TikTok from that, it just wouldn't be the same platform anymore. So TikTok has said credibly that they can't divest. It's just, if it takes effect, it's just going to be a ban. And the ban means you won't be able to get it in US app stores anymore, and they won't be able to host anything on servers based in the US anymore. But that's not all this law does. This law also says that in the future, the president may determine that any other social media platform is directed or controlled by a foreign adversary country, and it can and declare that it's a threat to national security and ban that. And so this law isn't just about banning TikTok, it's about banning other platforms the government doesn't like if it can come up with some tie to a foreign government and say it's a threat to national security.
Historically, when it comes to what the government considers an adversary, we've had a number of domestic groups that have been considered adversaries. Definitions continuously change. There were more than 100,000 people kidnapped in the Second World War based on their ethnicity, German, Japanese, and Italian Americans, for something like this. How does the government or how do courts determine who is an adversary and who isn't?
Well, the law says, and if I recall correctly, it's who you might expect. I think it's China, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, probably Cuba. I think that might be it. It's the big ones that they always bring up as our major foreign adversaries, supposedly.
Yes. When it comes to ByteDance Limited, is the claim that this company is physically in China, or is the claim that Xi Jinping and his party are actually controlling this company, ByteDance, which created or owns TikTok?
It's all hypothetical. So their offices are in Beijing, they're in China, uh, but there's no evidence that China has actually told TikTok to hand over users' data or has told TikTok what posts to promote or suppress or anything like that. In trying to justify this, the government can only say that, well, someday maybe China will do this because after all, they are in China and China can tell companies there what to do. So maybe they'll do something nefarious involving American users' data. We don't know what. Or maybe they will manipulate what Americans see in some way that we can't predict someday. So therefore, we need to shut the entire platform down now.
It's incredible. You see how insecure the current administration is, or maybe it's multiple administrations. When the government controls K through 12 education, the government heavily funds and subsidizes, controls the um, literature at universities. They have a corporate press which is constantly favorable to the regime, and they're terrified people might voluntarily download a free app that allows them to access tons of free information, the very, education that governments pretend to offer us. What is Based Politics Inc. versus Garland?
So that's our lawsuit challenging the TikTok ban. We represent Based Politics, which is a nonprofit that uses social media, especially TikTok, to connect with young people and give them ideas related to free markets and individual liberty. You might have seen their founders' accounts, Hannah Cox and Brad Palumbo. They're out there a lot on Twitter and then especially on TikTok. And they found that TikTok is really the place where they can connect with a Gen Z audience that they can't reach anywhere else. So many Gen Z people really are only on TikTok. They're not using Facebook, and they're not getting their news from other sources either. They're not getting it from traditional media, and they're not getting it from other social media platforms. So this is the place to be if you want to reach that audience with your ideas. And they've been very successful at it there. They've had numerous videos with well over 1 million views. And they talk about like, oh, communist China is going to control messages on this platform. Well, they're preaching individual liberty and free markets and all kinds of things that you would think the Chinese government would not want to promote. But they're being very successful at it, and they won't be able to do that anymore. They won't be able to reach this audience at all anywhere if this ban takes effect as scheduled on January 19th.
Interesting. I did not know that Brad and Hannah were semi-involved in this at all. That is very encouraging to hear. I really do like both of them. When it comes to the domestic population, so right now, a lot of people are in the mindset of we got this, look, we lost the terror war of 20 years. We thought that was going to be a great victory and really unite the nation. So now we got to find a different enemy. And now it's going to be China. Billion people, 5,000-year history. This is a really good enemy that we can take on. How do you get people out of the mindset of we need to take on this adversary and get them looking at how this violates the rights of the domestic population, Americans, which they claim to protect?
Right. You should be against this ban, regardless of what you think of China. I mean, of course, I don't like the Chinese government, the Communist Party of China. These are definitely bad people who do very bad things. But that doesn't have really anything to do with Americans' right to use TikTok. TikTok is a Chinese-based company, and as a result of that, the Chinese government can theoretically exert control over it in various ways. But that's not really relevant to Americans who choose to use TikTok. And when we're talking about shutting down TikTok, we're talking about shutting down 170 million Americans who use TikTok to share or hear speech, typically with other Americans. And you hear all this about, oh, it's an organ for Chinese propaganda. Well, people aren't consuming Chinese propaganda on TikTok. They're consuming the speech of other Americans about all kinds of things. Of course, you have very trivial things, cat videos and dances and whatever, but you also have people advancing serious ideas there. And a major motivation we know for enacting this ban was not anything to do with the Chinese government. It actually was because people in Congress don't like some of the things that people have been saying on TikTok, or they think they might say on it in the future. Mitt Romney, for example, said that the reason this got so much support in Congress was in part because there's so much more talk about Palestinians on TikTok than on other social media platforms. That doesn't have anything to do with China. It has to do with some other issue where the likes of Mitt Romney want to suppress dissent from the ideas they consider right. And even now, in defending this in court, the government comes forward and says, as one of its primary justifications, that we need to shut this down because China could promote or suppress certain content in a way that would affect the democratic process or affect public opinion, and in a way that goes against the US government's interests. Well, the whole point of the First Amendment is to stop the government from passing laws to suppress speech that it thinks goes against its interests. The fact that you guys think this goes against your interests isn't a reason to shut it down. It's a reason why it's unconstitutional. And, as far as China getting people's data, maybe, well, any user can make the choice to not download TikTok and make sure that nobody in China gets their data as a result, just as they make choices about whether they're going to use Facebook or Google or YouTube or whatever, in which case their data may be vulnerable to being accessed by the US government, which some people might think poses a more direct and immediate threat to themselves than the Chinese government.
Yeah, that's an incredible one. They really have to watch out in case we voluntarily download an app and give them our information while the NSA lies about spying on us indiscriminately all the time and then forces us to fund it with our tax dollars. Just completely absurd. What is the angle that you're planning to take in this case when you're arguing with the Supreme Court? Is it the same or different than how you speak to the public in general?
I mean, it's pretty much the same in that it's a really straightforward case. This is a suppression of free speech. It's shutting down a platform where people can express ideas and reach a unique audience, and that, but just on its face should violate the First Amendment. Then you have the fact that these people who passed it said openly that they wanted to suppress speech based on its ideas. That by itself should be the end of this thing. You have the fact that it's a prior restraint on speech. It doesn't punish speech after the fact. It stops speech from ever happening. Well, that is like almost automatic invalidation if you're imposing a prior restraint on speech. And yes, the Supreme Court has said in the past that you might be able to suppress speech for national security reasons. The court has always said that that would only be acceptable to stop an immediate threat, like, to thwart an imminent attack. And of course, you don't have that here at all. You have just the theoretical possibility that China might do something that the government doesn't like. It's a pretty straightforward argument, and it's surprising, really, that the lower court that heard this, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, didn't accept that. They recognized that this imposes a content-based restriction on speech. That is, the government is singling out a particular speech based on its content, based on the fact that it's on TikTok. And then, of course, we would also say based on their desire to suppress this speech that they said they want to suppress. And it said it should get the highest level of First Amendment scrutiny. And then it just said, well, it actually passes it because, well, the government invoked national security. And, we're not national security experts. We have to be deferential to the government in this context. And, well, yeah, TikTok has said there are other ways the government could address its concerns. TikTok came forward to try to make a deal with the government where there would be, third-party protections in place to protect people's data and all that sort of thing. And the government rejected all of that. And, if the government has a less restrictive alternative, it's supposed to take it under the First Amendment. And they weren't willing to do that. And the court here just said, well, they say that's not good enough. They don't really explain why in any detail, but they say that's not good enough. And so we're just going to defer to them on that. And of course, that's really disturbing that the government could just basically say the words national security, submit a few declarations from government officials where they say, yeah, we really need to do this without a lot of detail. And that would be enough for a court. Another thing the government tried to do in the lower court, when they filed their brief with the court, they submitted these 3 declarations from federal officials, but they did it with many paragraphs of those declarations blacked out. And then they also blacked out many pages of their brief that they filed with the court. And they said that they're going to file the unredacted versions of those things with the court, and the court can look at that, but this is classified, and so nobody else should get to see this, including the attorneys for the other side. And so the court should consider this in upholding our ban, but you guys can't see it, and therefore you guys can't challenge it. And fortunately, the lower court said that it didn't rely on the things that were hidden from us. But it's quite audacious of the government to want to suppress speech on a massive scale and then not even let you know why or give you the opportunity to challenge their supposed evidence. But the details of that wouldn't matter anyway, because they don't claim there's an imminent threat. And that's what you need if you're going to invoke national security.
Is there I know less than anything about the law, so, this might sound like an ignorant question. Is there any way that there could be an antitrust angle here? All I heard about for years was that the social media companies are monopolies. Also, now we need to outlaw a competitor. Well, 2 minutes ago, it was dangerous oligopolies that have too much power, so then you get a competitor who was such a big competitor, now you're afraid of it, now you wanna ban it. Is there any way you could say that it would be an antitrust violation to outlaw a competitor in an industry that only has 3 or 4 big players?
I'm not an antitrust expert, but I think in general, if the government does something to help prop up a monopoly, then that's okay, right? That's the government is, of course, the government is a monopoly, and and all the time it does things to create monopolies and cartels and prop them up. So unfortunately, antitrust laws probably wouldn't work to the good in this situation. And of course, we know that these people don't care per se about monopolies or concentration. What they really care about is what they can control. And a lot of times, of course, the government prefers fewer competitors in any kind of market because that's just, that's easier to control when you have one party or a few parties to deal with, especially when you're talking about manipulating speech. Another point on the law I might mention that's on our side, something we've raised with the court, is that the Supreme Court has actually said that you have a right to obtain foreign communist propaganda, like from a foreign government. There was a law passed many decades ago where they said, well, if you get sent communist propaganda from a communist country, the post office will hold that and then send you a card informing you that you have been sent this propaganda. And if you want to receive it, then you check a box on that and you give that back to the post office, and then they'll give you your propaganda. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's a barrier to communication. It violates the First Amendment. You can hear any ideas you want, and you can't put extra steps in the way of certain ideas. So even if TikTok were pushing straight communist propaganda, which it isn't, the First Amendment would still protect it under a Supreme Court precedent.
And they act as if TikTok is like a thing that you turn on and it just plays one TikTok into every household. They don't address the fact that there's a million channels to subscribe to and you can block channels. You can only watch the ones you sub to. It's so empowering. If you compare it to the cable that I used to have, like $120 a month for a ton of junk that I ended up canceling. This costs $0 and gives me more access to productive information than I ever could have imagined from more great minds and even people who don't have TikTok accounts. John J. Mearsheimer, I can't imagine he has a TikTok account, but he has a ton of people making TikToks of his work. He's much older, the younger generation. There are so many benefits to this. I can just imagine explaining this to my great grandpa as he's escaping the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the First World War, that one day you'll be able to communicate to millions or billions of people across the world. The average person will be empowered, not just the establishments that have access to the newspapers and buy ink by the barrel, but the average person will be empowered. The concept that the American government in the land of the free would ban something like this, that so many millions of Americans benefit from, is just absolutely psychotic. Do you have any statistics on or any idea of the number of people who are self-employed through TikTok who just use it as their primary way of getting their voice out there and, gaining a monetary income?
I don't have those statistics offhand, but I do know that lots of people do make their living through TikTok. So this not only is going to be an unprecedented suppression of free speech, it's also going to destroy the livelihoods of countless thousands, no doubt, of people. It really is extraordinary in that way. And, the government will say, well, you can still say whatever you want. You go do YouTube Shorts or Facebook Reels or whatever. But of course, you can't reach the same audience in those places. And TikTok really is extraordinary in its ability to know who is going to be receptive to your message and connect you to those people. And it seems like, I don't use it, but it seems like from what I hear from people, it's really good at just catering to what is going to be interesting to you, including things that you maybe wouldn't have thought to look up yourself because you haven't heard of them, but yet somehow, based on your patterns, it's good at predicting that. And I suppose some people find that sort of mind reading a little bit disturbing, but many people find it to be a great service, and they should be allowed to take advantage of that service if they want to, whether it's coming from a company in China or anywhere else.
And for those who find it disturbing, uninstall the app. Takes what, 30, 45 seconds? We have to wait for the government to come in and do basically everything. I think that was JD Vance's point when he was on Joe Rogan's show. He goes, we need to really step up the regulation of social media, because what's happening on the screen are about 10,000 things that your brain is engaged with, but you only know about two of them. What do you think about the argument that there is such an information asymmetry between these content producers and the content viewers that the state needs to step in and be the mediator, making sure that the masses aren't exploited by the companies?
Well, why would we trust the government to decide what purveyors of information we receive and which we don't? We know the government is going to exercise that power in a way that skews things to support the government's narratives on things and suppress dissenting narratives. That's expressly what they're doing here, and what we would expect the government to do in any situation like that. And, as far as consumer awareness goes, I think people are pretty aware that all of these platforms use algorithms to manipulate what they see in various ways, whether that's in choosing advertising for them, in choosing what information they see or don't see. People have become kind of good consumers in a sense that if you want completely free and unmoderated discussion, people are pretty aware that you could go to X and get that there. If you prefer to have things more curated to your delicate sensibilities, there are other platforms that will do that for you. And people know that with their cell phones, they're giving away their locations through various apps and giving away information about their purchases and all kinds of stuff like that. Not everybody knows the full extent, no doubt, but I think people are pretty savvy now and know that a lot of this is going on. And by and large, people just choose to go on using things anyway. I know all this. And part of me would rather not share my information with Google, but at the end of the day, I conclude that, well, I want to use Google Maps and I want to watch YouTube videos, and I'm willing to pay that cost to get this service. And that should be my choice to make, not the government's. And of course, if the issue really is information asymmetry, well, fine, give people more information, inform people that this is going on if you think they don't know. That would be a way to address this that doesn't just shut down everybody's speech, which is like the most extreme response that you could have to this.
Exactly. He said this on the Joe Rogan Experience, which is like the second most watched podcast in the English speaking language. Hey, there's a ton of info we don't have. Please tell us. I mean, surely you're smart enough to know enough to regulate it. So surely you could tell us and give us a fair warning, telling us to not walk off this cliff. Could you imagine if he actually believed that information asymmetry justified regulation? Jacob, you can't buy a car because you don't really know how it's made. What's going on in that car is so beyond what you understand. I'm not going to let you buy it. You don't understand the complexities of your computer, so I'm not going to let you buy one of those because you won't know what to do with it. You don't know how houses are made, so I'm going to stop you from buying those. My heavens, thank God he just says this nonsense and doesn't actually believe it. When you look at uh, something like the Mises Institute has all these videos. This is the free online education. This is right on TikTok. Stefan Molyneux, also one of my heroes, has a ton of free information. This guy has researched this stuff. Even if you hate him, let's hear the bad ideas and exchange, why we think they're right, why they think they're wrong. Not to mention, I have my own TikTok that I upload stuff to. It's just so psychotic that they want to forcibly stop people from engaging in mutually beneficial information exchanges. It's like the ultimate psychopathic boyfriend who says, my girlfriend can't talk to anyone. Nope, just me. They might endanger her.
Yeah, right. Well, of course, that's been the Biden administration's attitude from the beginning. Within days after taking office, the White House is sending messages to people at Twitter and Facebook and so on, complaining about posts about COVID, complaining about parody accounts targeting the Biden family. And for their first 2 years in office, they're having posts deleted, having people suspended, having people banned for dissenting from the government narrative on COVID. And finally, in 2023, a court issued an injunction putting an end to all that. But the damage had already been done there, because when people needed to speak about these things openly the most, they weren't able to. But then they turn around and enact this TikTok ban. And so it seems like control of speech online is one of the dominant themes of the Biden administration. And so hopefully that's coming to an end. There may be some things to like about J.D. Vance, and his attitude toward social media censorship is maybe one of them. But at least President Trump has said or signaled that he does not support this TikTok ban. Unfortunately, it will be too late for him to do anything about it when he takes office, because he takes office on January 20th. This thing takes effect on January 19th. And even when he does take office, well, this law will be in effect unless Congress repeals it, and he signs that repeal. And it passed with bipartisan support, so repeal could be hard. I would hope that if the Supreme Court doesn't do anything in the meantime, that Trump would just say, well, the First Amendment trumps all other considerations. I've taken an oath to uphold the Constitution. Therefore, we can't enforce this. Therefore, we won't enforce this. But it would be much better if the Supreme Court struck this down, so we don't have to rely on the goodwill of a particular president. And sometimes, again, like as with the COVID stuff, you end up not getting the court decisions that you want because the court weighs in too late after the damage is done. The Supreme Court has an opportunity to put an end to this before it ever takes effect. And so that's what we're hoping it'll do.
If you look at someone like Ketanji Brown Jackson, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, it seems like they have the progressive worldview of looking at things through the lens of the powerful and the powerless, the exploited and the exploiters. Is there any way you're going to curtail this argument to where they might be on Biden's side and feel an obligation to vote in favor of whatever Biden had supported? Is there anything in particular you're going to say to those minds that you think will really be persuasive and put pressure on them to vote against the Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act?
That's a good question. I think, as a general matter, they would acknowledge the right to free speech online. They would recognize that affecting companies' content moderation policies can violate the First Amendment. So I'm not sure that they would be against us. It's a little hard to read where particular justices will be on this. We had a bipartisan panel in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. The judge who wrote the opinion was Judge Douglas Ginsburg, who has a reputation for being a libertarian, people say, as these things go among federal judges. And yet, the invocation of China and national security was enough to win that judge over. So we just have to hope that this court, that's been pretty good on speech issues in general, will be good on this and won't let national security concerns overwhelm everything, because they should recognize that would open the door to censorship of all kinds of speech, including the speech that they like, whether they're on the left or the right.
So is it that they're so afraid of speech? The idea that, well, we can't trade with China because, the government influences this product and we don't want that here. Well, if you haven't noticed, almost everything we have is made in China. So it has to be a case of they don't want access to something that could immediately update. And, next thing you know, Xi Jinping is giving a global message to usher in the CCP totalitarianism in America. What is it about this that they are so terrified about? I know you mentioned the thing with Mitt Romney talking about people having access to the atrocities in Gaza. Why is it that governments all over the globe are constantly seeking to restrict speech specifically? Why are they so insecure about this?
Well, because of course, speech is a threat to their power. If they can control the narrative and control the information people receive, there's going to be a lot less dissent. Of course, if people had full access to information about COVID related issues from the beginning, it would have been a lot harder to get them to go along with staying in their homes for months and shutting down their businesses and not having funerals and seeing their loved ones and all this stuff would be much harder to control in an environment of free speech than it is when there's one message coming through the media and social media that gives the impression that every reasonable person thinks the same thing. I mean, of course, information is a threat to government power in general. It's why governments have always done it. And the recognition of that is a reason why we have a First Amendment. And we're very, say what you will about the Constitution in general, but look at countries that don't have a First Amendment, that the government can get away with virtually anything in almost every other country when it comes to suppressing speech. But we have had a lot more free expression because we do have an imperfectly enforced First Amendment. And it's really critical that the Supreme Court use it here, because this is really where it really counts. When there's every First Amendment case is important, but they take on fringe issues of people making crush videos and things like that, and say that violates the First Amendment. Well, here you're talking about the speech of activities of 170 million people, something really unprecedented. So I would certainly hope that they would realize that this is where it counts. This is exactly what it's for.
There was a law in, I want to say, Prussia in the 17 or 1800s, and the wording was it made it a crime to inflame the passions of the feeble minded. When it comes to the downsides of free speech, do you see any overall downsides, all else equal, that sometimes it's better for there to be a monopolist who says what can and can't be said in a geographical area just for the sake of keeping order, just for the sake of keeping what I'm sure they would consider to be low IQ people from having too much power in the society to spread misinformation?
Well, when you said inflaming the passions of the feeble-minded, I thought, isn't that what politicians do? Isn't that their whole deal? And so, like, they're the ones that we should be worried about. And so, when you're suppressed, like when they're the arbiters of what can be said, and they're picking and choosing what people can hear, that makes it less likely for the truth to get out. Of course, when you have any monopolist on speech, you're going to get things tilted in favor of things that serve the interest of that arbiter of truth, and you get further away from the truth. And of course, free speech doesn't guarantee that the best ideas will win, but at least it ensures that they can get out there so that they have a chance of prevailing. And you don't have that if the government is picking and choosing what people can hear. And of course, people can come up with hypotheticals about, well, wouldn't it technically serve the people's interest better if they could do it in this emergency or that emergency. But however, it's unlikely that we need that in any situation. But even if you can come up with situations where you might think it would serve the public's interest, the precedent would be so dangerous that it wouldn't be worth doing anyway. And of course, putting aside the justice of the matter, which is it's always wrong to stop people from speaking, no matter what they're saying. And certainly, even from my perspective, free speech is something of a dangerous thing. Free speech means people can advocate for socialism and communism, which, like, the worst ideas there are. And in some places and times, that might mean that they'll prevail. And yet, the alternative of government controlling the ideas that are out there is worse. Just like with so many rights that we have, protections against searches and seizures maybe means that some criminals will go free, but we accept that because the alternative of the government being able to search everybody all the time is so much worse. And of course, those of us who believe in liberty, not only believe that that's the just thing, we also think that's going to work out the best for everybody in the long run.
A lot of people have accepted the fundamental claim that the state has a unique right to criminalize economic activities between consenting adults under the guise of keeping them safe. Do you think there's a principal difference between keeping me safe from the food I buy, from the electronics I buy, and the speech I hear? Why is it free speech that people seem to get more worked up on rather than freedom of commerce in any other product or service that they consume?
Well, I agree, of course, that these rights are equally important as a libertarian. In either case, the government is forcibly interfering with the actions of peaceful people, which I would say is always wrong, and it may be even more serious if you're stopping somebody from earning a living in their profession or whatever. The free speech, of course, we can see how that's particularly important in the sense that if the government shuts that down, it becomes much harder to defend all other rights if you can't talk about it. So, there's something kind of extra special in that sense about the First Amendment. And we might also say the Second Amendment, in that those are sort of guarantors of your other rights because they allow you to speak out on behalf of those rights and then ultimately to defend your life against threats to your life if it becomes necessary. So there's that. Now, the Supreme Court does treat free speech differently, not only from economic liberties, but from most other liberties. In that, it's one of those that the court has said is fundamental. The court has said that we have some rights that are fundamental. Free speech is one. They've more recently said that the right to keep and bear arms is one. That's good. And because of that, if a law infringes on those fundamental rights, the courts will give it more serious scrutiny, like First Amendment violations, where they're discriminating based on the content of speech, get what they call strict scrutiny, where the government is supposed to show a compelling interest, which is like the highest interest. There aren't very many of them. And that the law is narrowly tailored to serve that interest so that the government couldn't serve its compelling interest in any other way that wouldn't infringe on the right as much. Now, even that is kind of loose from our standards as libertarians because, the First Amendment just says Congress shall make no law. There's no, well, did you have a compelling interest and was it right? It seems like it is and should be a blanket prohibition. But the best we can do so far is strict scrutiny, and they give that to fundamental rights. But then when it comes to other rights, including the right to economic liberty, they might recognize that they would say maybe that the 14th Amendment implies a right to freedom of contract or economic liberty, but they say that laws that infringe on those rights only get rational basis review, where all the government has to do is show that it had some rational reason for restricting the right, and courts will say it's okay. And in doing that, they don't have to prove that their law serves the interest they say it serves. It just has to have like some kind of there basically just has to be like a logical structure to their argument, and that's about it. And courts will rubber stamp that. And of course, that's totally outrageous. All of these rights are fundamental. The founders talked about life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that encompasses all of this stuff. And of course, regardless of what the founders said, we as libertarians think that just is your right as a human being, and none of these things should be infringed upon. But we find ourselves in a situation where the First Amendment rights get better protection than most other rights, and that means that people who want to protect rights look for ways to frame things in terms of free speech violations, even if there's other ways they violate rights. If you focus on the speech, you might get the courts to take you seriously in a way that they wouldn't otherwise.
Are you going to have arguments structured in such a way that specifically appeal to the more conservative mindset of seeing the world as a battle between civilization and barbarism when it comes to someone like Justice Thomas or, gosh, not Scalia, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Coney Barrett? Is there anything specific you're going to be saying to that, or are you just looking at the Constitution, hoping that they'll uphold their end of the bargain, that's what they're going by, or are you going to try to appeal to them on more of a personal level?
Well, I don't know about civilization versus barbarism, but of course, when you're arguing to any judges, justices, you want to think about what they've said in the past and frame your arguments in a way that is consonant with that, as opposed to fighting against it. Thomas and Gorsuch, I think they've been pretty consistently excellent on the First Amendment, and they do take threats to speech, including laws that would manipulate political speech to favor one side or the other. I think they take that very seriously. Justice Alito has been very good on free speech. The others, have their pros and cons from my perspective. But yeah, I mean, you kind of do have to ultimately hope that they value free speech enough, and that the invocation of national security is not going to shake them from that. But really, all the law, regardless of who said it in the past. I mean, from conservative judges, liberal judges, really across the board, all the case law up till now is on our side, for the reasons I said. You can't discriminate based on content. You can't stop communist propaganda. You can't just invoke national security unless it's like imminent. They would really have to depart from everything the court has said through the years on the First Amendment to rule in favor of the government here. And I'd like to think that none of the justices are prepared to make that kind of departure.
When it comes to lessons we can learn, whether it's from these laws themselves or how the Supreme Court's interacted with, the ones that come to mind are the Sedition Acts 1798, making it a crime to publicly speak out against the state, the Espionage or Trading with the Enemies Act of 1917. When it comes to lessons of American history, when it comes to regulating speech, what do you think are the major takeaways people should appreciate and what we could learn from?
Well, you're right. I say it's a departure. Of course, we have had terrible violations of free speech by the federal government, particularly in wartime. And we had the Alien Sedition Act, the terrible suppression of speech during World War I, and also to some extent during World War II. And fortunately, protection for speech has really only gotten better and better since then, as they've brought in like all categories of expression. They have subjected restrictions based on their content to the highest scrutiny and made that clear, with some unfortunate deviations here and there, the things that we would like them to correct. But the general trend has been in favor of greater protection of speech, and that's a good thing. We all benefit from that. And of course, recently, when we've had on social media X bucking the trend of controlling information in a way that the government likes, I think a lot of people appreciate now that we're getting ideas and possibly seeing political outcomes that we wouldn't have seen but for that. And we see that the threat is greater than ever in in the way this administration has acted, where it wants to shut it down on COVID. It wants to shut it down on, before this administration, shutting down, the Hunter Biden laptop story and all kinds of stuff like that. They want to do it. They will do it if they can get away with it at all. And so that's why, whatever you think of TikTok and the communist government, I can understand how that makes some people uneasy, because it's totally fair to hate the communist Chinese government at least as much as you hate the US government if you're a person who cares about liberty, because it is really terrible. But people shouldn't let that blind them to the reality that this is a censorship tool of the US government, and that it will not end with TikTok if this law stands, because of the power it gives the president to ban other platforms in the future. I'm sure, or pretty confident, that if Kamala Harris had won this election, we would be soon seeing efforts to shut down X based on this law that says, well, if you're directed or controlled by a foreign adversary, the president can shut you down. Because after this law was passed, we saw stories in the media trying to tie Elon Musk to Vladimir Putin as though he's taking cues from Putin somehow. And that may be ridiculous, but of course that doesn't stop them. They'll get their narrative out there and they'll act based on that narrative. And I think that's what we would be seeing imminently if Harris had been elected. But we shouldn't be complacent just because Trump was elected, because you can't. Although he said relatively good things about these, you can't count on anybody. And in the long run, there may be, there will, if this law is on the books, there will be people who want to use it, and they will use it.
Yeah, really. Come to think of it, I guess it is a threat to national security. Not, of course, having something people can voluntarily download. The threat to national security is one group forcibly stopping millions of people from exchanging information. It is just amazing to scroll through. This is just the explore thing. Of course, I'm logged in on TikTok at this point, but it's not like I get CNN and MSNBC's TikToks. These are millions of views that the average person. It is so empowering and so evil that they want to take this away from people. Even if you think, it tends to be more trivial things. Well, I've watched regular TV. It's not exactly the most Aristotle-like information coming out of the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills or whatever people are watching in general. And one thing on your Russia case, President Biden was on the presidential debate stage when he said 51 intelligence officers have said that what he's talking about, my son's laptop, is a Russian plan. Either said plan or plant. Um, this turned out to be completely fabricated. They had no evidence when all those 51 liars got together. Hillary Clinton said 17 intelligence agencies, military and civilian, have confirmed that it was Russia and the Kremlin who hacked my emails. That was a complete lie. The New York Times, I want to say, redacted it. The date June 29th of 2017 comes to mind. But these stories are completely fake. And this is what, I guess, because Russia would be called a foreign adversary on that day at that time, they could have outlawed any criticism of those stories. So we'd be living in complete fake Alice in Wonderland world if we just listened to the mass murdering politicians all the time. I'm so thankful for your time. Is there anything else people need to know about this, and where can they go for more information?
Well, I think people should know that this is a real and serious threat, and that it's very important that the U.S. Supreme Court strike this down when it has the opportunity. We'll do our best to persuade them to do that. If people want to know more, they can go to our website, libertyjusticecenter.org. They can also check us out on X, LJ Center, or you can check me out on X, Jacob Huebert.
Thanks to everyone for watching Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone, and the Libertarian Institute. Mr. Huebert, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.